Please listen to this audio podcast carefully and just let yourself kind of go along with it. You might want to listen to it a couple of times. The intention of this audio podcast is to introduce you to the notions of objectivity in parentheses rather than just straight objectivity. The podcast is referring more to the way an individual perceives the world than a culture, but try to expand it to include cultural worldviews. The basic notion is that we not only have a direct perception of the physical world, but we have an experience of the cultural world as well. Often people will talk about a Christian worldview or materialist worldview. Where I'm coming from is our worldview is a composite of a whole variety of things, and everything we experience in the world as we experience it is our worldview. And we sometimes have the tendency to think that the way we experience the world isn't a worldview, but is the way the world actually is, and that anyone who doesn't agree with us is simply wrong or ignorant. So keep that in mind as you listen to this podcast. This is laying the foundation, even though in the podcast I don't talk about worldviews as such. It's part of laying the foundation for everything that will come after during the next 9 weeks. There's some challenging ideas going on. For some of you that have some philosophy in your background, may not be so challenging as I've found it in the past. For the scientists among us that have been trained into this notion of a single objective world, you may find this particularly challenging. But hang on and just consider the ideas. Don't decide whether they're right or wrong, crazy or uncrazy. Just think about them. Allow your reflections to kind of settle into you as you listen to the podcast. So good luck with it, and away we go. The multiverse that Maturana is proposing, or as he calls it, objectivity in parentheses, as opposed to objectivity without parentheses, what he's saying is that the world we perceive is not the world. It is a world. And it's really important to understand that he is not suggesting that we're making things up out of whole cloth. This isn't solipsism. He's not suggesting we are making up the physical world, that there's nothing in the physical world until we as observers observe it. Some Eastern religions carry this idea of no objective reality to the extreme, and they say there is no physical reality. We're simply dreaming all this. Everything we experience is a dream. And if you take it to a solipsistic extreme, I can say that you guys don't exist. You're part of my dream. I'm floating alone in the universe, and I'm just dreaming it all. And it doesn't make sense for me to say that you'd be doing the same because you don't really exist out there. As far as I can tell, there's no real proof that there is a world out there. There's no way that anybody could prove to me that you're real, that the world is real. Because anything that I experience that you would say, I'll just say, yeah, that's part of my dream. And so from my perspective, and certainly not everyone would agree with me, it's a matter of aesthetics. I personally choose to not live in a solipsistic world. I prefer that you guys actually exist out there. You're actually real people out there, and not just part of my imagination. So what Maturana is saying, and the first claim isn't radical, it's pretty straightforward once we pause to think about it, that all we have to work with is our experience. As a shorthand, we talk about the world out there, whether it's other people or trees or rocks. We talk about the world out there. But we can't know the world out there. What we know is our experience in here. From a certain perspective, and this is something where I question some Maturana, is I'm not entirely clear that this inside-outside is as strong as he claims it to be. I'm not as clear on this sort of autonomous, closed organization of the organism. It seems to me very possible that at a deeper intuitive level, we're not anywhere near as cut off as it seems on the surface of operating through our senses. But we'll set that aside for a moment. So I have my experience, and fundamentally, any philosopher would agree with that. The issue is, how does my experience relate to a world or the world out there? Realism claims that what my senses are doing is reporting what's going on out there. And inside, I create an accurate representation of the external world. It's a mirror representation of the external world. Based on Maturana's idea that the world cannot inform us, that the world cannot cause a structural change in a system, from that perspective, it follows that, the world can't cause a representation inside of me. The representation that I have of the world, that I create of the world, is a reflection of my own structure. And because each of us has a unique structure to some degree, each of us will experience the world differently. Now, the radical thing Maturana is saying, not only do we experience the world differently, but in fact, there is no world out there with features inherent in it that we're experiencing differently, that we generate that world through our interactions with it. Now, we can take this either as kind of an immediate sense that the world we experience triggers a systemic change in us as a structurally determined system. Not only do outside influences only trigger changes rather than cause, but we ourselves, as a structurally determined system, determine what the triggers are that we will allow to impinge on us. So, classically, our eyes can only see certain wavelengths of light. And so the wavelengths of light that are beyond our perceptual gear, our structure does not allow those wavelengths of light, infrared, ultraviolet, usually, to impact us. And the same thing with wavelengths of hearing, etc. So only certain parts of all that's out there come into us and trigger changes in us that allows us to generate an experience within ourselves. So the experience we generate within ourselves is not a direct reflection of out there. So the question arises, well, if there is no objective reality, then, where are we left? We're just left floating around out here. To not get completely sucked away in this into solipsism, we have to remember that our experience arises from our structure, and our structure has arisen through a history of structural coupling with the world. And so there is a relationship of some sort between our experience and the external world. The issue is that the external world is not just as we experience, but we're generating an experience that has some correspondence with the external world. The way I like to look at it, and I'm not clear that Maturana would go along with this, but there is physicality out there, and we can either look at that physicality as sort of lumpy, and it doesn't have any set features, and the actual features we experience arise through our engagement with the world, through the way we distinguish different objects, and I'll get to that in a moment, or that the world out there is just infinite potential, and in our engagement with it arise the features of the world that we experience. To look at this in a really radical way, that there is no single objective world, just imagine how an earthworm might experience the world. That earthworm is simply not living in the same world that you and I are living in. More subtly, you and I are not living in the same world either. There is some difference. There is also a great deal of commonality in the way you and I experience the world. based on the similarity of our structure. We're both biological beings. We're both mammals. We're both human beings. And so these structures, our sensory structure, the way our minds are structured, are very similar. And so our experience of the world arises in a similar way. So there'll be common ground between us. Further, we live together in language. And language not only reports the world, we not only talk about our experience with language, but language which is either the same or very parallel to thinking structures our experience. And that is a really key point. We don't simply experience the world naively. The way we experience the world is structured by language. So the way an infant, a pre-linguistic infant, experiences the world is not the same as that person will experience the world once they become embedded in language. Where I differ with what I think Maturana is saying is, from my perspective, we have the capacity to be outside of language at the same time we're inside. And we have the capacity to go beyond the structures of language. Anytime we're thinking about our experience or trying to report it, whether through writing or speaking, we're back in language. But the raw experience of simply sitting and watching a sunset without thinking about it, just absorbing the flow of color and motion in the sky, not identifying the colors, simply the raw experience, to me that seems beyond language. Objects. Capra talked about a tree, and that trees are nowhere near as separate entities as we sometimes think because they're all interconnected with their roots. A way I like to look at it is imagine staring through a clear sheet of acetate at the world. No thinking, no concepts, just the flow of color and motion and patterns. That's what you're experiencing. Imagine an infant just experiencing the world, not knowing what any of the objects are, just this flowing motion of color and sound and the raw sensations. In some sense, that is the isness of the world. In order to start making sense of that world, I look for regularities of pattern. And this is what happens to an infant. And this process is accelerated incredibly as the infant learns language, as caregivers start pointing to different parts of the world and attaching names to those parts. So here I am doing it on my own, and I look at the world and I see some regularities, and I go, wow, okay. And I draw an outline on the acetate around something, around a shape. And then I look and I see another shape that's not quite the same, but it's similar, and I draw an outline around that. And I go, wow, those two look pretty close to the same. I'm going to create a category. I'm not doing this consciously. I'm walking through how I see it. This is a metaphor. And I go, okay, I'm going to create a category, and I'm going to call those things trees. I'm going to ignore the differences between them and focus on the commonality and say, those are trees. I'm going to do the same thing with this shape over here that looks like that, and that one, I'll call those dogs. Then I'll do the same over here, and these are people. And so little by little, from this unified flow, I build up a world of separate objects. I've created those objects by distinguishing those bits of my experience from all the rest around. In some sense, those objects don't exist in and of themselves. They only exist by excluding what's around them. Those objects are bits of the world that I've surrounded and differentiated from the background. I continue to do this, and it's an incredibly useful thing. It helps me predict the world. It helps me predict what's going to happen. Then I can start doing the same thing on a more abstract level with the different qualities. I experience that on that object, and the same thing over here. I'll call that the color red. And then I can, this is one experience, and I'll call that soft, and this was another, I'll call that hard. And so I can go on building up these categories of experience in more and more abstract levels. And all of this is incredibly useful. And this is the process by which we generate the world we live in, the experience we live in. And this is what Maturana means, as I understand it, by living in language. The way we move beyond that is to consciously relax our focus on that acetate and allow ourselves to experience the raw world beyond. The difficulty comes when we draw so much on the acetate that it becomes opaque. We can no longer see through it. We can no longer experience the world beyond, but we're simply locked into, surrounded by, and locked into this creation of concepts that we live inside. And this world of ideas and things and concepts is not a living world. It's a world of our own creation, and it's a static and dead world. And this becomes a huge problem because it takes the livingness out of life. The process of doing this is a living process. The process of distinguishing forms is a living process. The forms themselves have become abstractions. There's a couple other problems with this. The world is fluid and ever-changing. These concepts, constructs, are static. So there's a sort of constant dislocation between this world of constructs we live inside and the world flowing by us on the outside. The world flowing by on the outside, there is nothing to cling to. It's gone. Everything arises and is instantly gone. But our world of constructs appears static, and so we cling to these different things. We cling to certain experiences, and that generates a huge amount of pain. And that's kind of the center of Buddhist thinking, is this clinging or pushing away is what generates this attachment in a changing world. Most of us have had this experience in intimate relationships when we start to see a person a certain way and we can't see them any other way. And we might become bored with that person because they seem the same. They're not changing. They're just kind of The chances are that the person is changing or trying to change, but what we're experiencing in them is not them who they are, but this image that we have, this inner notion that we have of the person. Most of us have also experienced when somebody else has an image of us that they continue to relate to, and we're continually going either inside or to them, that's not who I am. You have a strange notion of who I am. I don't experience myself to be the person you're relating to. And this is real classic in children and parents, in both directions. As kids, we think, God, why won't my parents just let me be who I am? And we forget that we do the same thing with our parents, not allowing them to be who they are. So the question arises, why not just use subjectivity instead of objectivity in parentheses? What Maturana is trying to point out here again is that we're not dealing with subjectivity, that we just make up the world out of whole cloth any way we want. That the world that we experience is an objective world, but it's not universal. It's objective to me, and it's objective to the collective which generates this world together, but it's not the same world as other people live in, other cultures live in. And so it's this pointing out that the world we experience arises through our structure, through our common language, but nevertheless, it is a world that we enact. It's not an objective world pre-given out there that we discover through a looking glass. Capra talks about believing that Maturana's view is healing the ancient rift of mind and brain, mind and body, and determinism and free will. My sense is that this is an ancient conundrum. Philosophers have been addressing this problem for thousands of years, and over people have claimed that they've found the resolution to this. And my sense is Copra's claim is another one in that. Maturana's view doesn't really resolve this issue. It contributes some to our reflection on it, but it seems to me that Capra overstates the case some. Here's a caveat that seems important to me. May not be, but it seems important to me. Christian de Quincey is a philosopher of mind. He's written a number of books. The one I really like is his first one, Radical Nature. He's very accessible. If you're interested in these notions, I suggest Christian de Quincey, Radical Nature. It's a good read. And he's arguing for panpsychism. And panpsychism is the notion that consciousness or mind or sentience, it's incredibly important to both be precise and loose in these definitions because it's very easy to get confused. But some sort of subjectivity is present in matter, inherent in matter from the Big Bang on. Not that rocks can think, but that nothing is simply a dead object. De Quincey doesn't use life in the same way I do. For me, I experience the whole world is alive at times, and De Quincey goes, no, the world is sentient but not alive. We differ in that. To me, biological life is one manifestation of life in the same way that thinking is one manifestation of sentience. But even the most liberal scientific explanation tends to be that consciousness emerges. It's an emergent property of complex living systems. That there wasn't consciousness, and then there was. And that can start in the most simple of forms, in sentience, in cognition. There wasn't, and then there was, and this is called an emergent property. And it's equated to something like liquid. That you take a gas hydrogen and you put it together with the gas oxygen and a whole new property of liquid emerges. And so it's this notion of emergent property is applied to sentience or consciousness. And Christian de Quincey argues, possibly logically, I have some questions, that's a miracle. You can't have that philosophically. It's different. Moving from a gas to a liquid, the emergent property of a liquid is still a physical property. It's still in the realm of the physical. Moving from physical into this completely radically different domain of awareness doesn't fly. You can't create something from nothing. And you're creating something from nothing in that unless you have from the very beginning in the inherent structure of the universe, some proto-sentience that can develop into consciousness, you can't somewhere along the trajectory of the physical world all of a sudden introduce this completely radically new property. You go along and you explain this and you explain that. You say we bring the neurons and the neurons do this and they get very complicated. You have these physical processes that are completely unconscious. And then all of a sudden awareness or proto-awareness pops into existence. And De Quincey argues pretty convincingly from my perspective, this doesn't fly. I find De Quincey's approach attractive because it tends to explain my own experience, that at times when I move beyond these conceptualizations of separate objects, when I slip out of this cognitive conceptual world into the living flow of the universe, it feels as though everything is alive and aware. That consciousness somehow, and I'm not in any way trying to define how, but I have an experience that consciousness is inherently present in the universe. And this isn't arguing for a separate God. This is inherent in the physical world, is this property of consciousness. The panpsychism view is an answer to dualism or materialism, and it's a different kind of way of looking at the world. Again, all of these things from my perspective are just likely stories. We don't know what the world is. We have an experience, and then we tell stories about it. I find that I don't know. I drift back and forth among all those different points, and it depends on I don't know what it depends on. I just know that I see the world in different ways. But to me, the most radical is the notion of the materialist, for which consciousness is an epiphenomenon. that it doesn't have any efficacy, that our notions of freedom and choice and all that are simply illusory. Maturana comes close to this at times. He tries to explain the world in purely physicalist terms. And in my view, he kind of paints himself into a corner there. And every time I read it, and I may be just missing it, but it looks like he's starting from a scientific perspective, saying the world is structurally determined. But sooner or later, he's got to get to the place that consciousness has an influence on what we do. And it looks like a miraculous smoke and mirrors shift to me, that he's arguing for structural determinism, and then the next thing, all of a sudden we have choice and reflection has an influence on our choices. And I think that that's one of the fundamental problems, trying to explain the world in purely materialistic, physicalist terms without including consciousness as a fundamental aspect of the universe. When you do include consciousness, you have to soften the notions of predictability and determinism. One of the things I like about some philosophical perspectives, and Ken Wilber, who we'll meet, talks about this, he said, it's nonsense to believe that matter always behaves the same. So matter that's organized in more hierarchic levels, consciousness has a stronger and stronger influence. And so matter in a human body simply does not behave the same as matter in a rock. It's not predictable in the same way, and consciousness has a much stronger influence. That's pretty appealing to me. The notion of trying to describe life in the same kind of physics and chemistry terms as we would a rock or a fluid just doesn't add up. To shift that and explain life both through biology and then through higher explanations of the impact of consciousness. Okay, this is a bit of a summary, and so it's a repetition of what I've said, and hopefully there's some examples that might solidify some of these notions a bit. So in our discussions of objectivity in parenthesis, we need to keep in mind that we are structurally coupled with our medium. We are not arguing for solipsism, where we simply make up the world any old way we want. We are exploring objectivity in parenthesis, not pure subjectivity. Yes, we each live in our own objective, in parenthesis, reality, but there are structural constraints. As in evolution, where some forms and behaviors do not suffice to continue to exist, so too with some realities, in parentheses. In my reality, I may believe I am able to stop a speeding bullet with my thoughts, but if I test it out, I'm likely to be in for a quick shift of perspective. This is not to deny that someone somewhere might be able to do it, but in my domain, I very likely cannot. I think we need to be careful when exploring Maturana's ideas not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's not that we're creating a physical world out there, but that our experience of the world is strongly constrained by our structural coupling with that world and the structure of our systems that arose through that structural coupling. Normally we assume that when we all agree on something, that thing is objectively, without parentheses, real out there. Note that this is objectivity without parentheses. Maturana turns it around and claims that which we all agree on we call objectively, in parentheses, real. See the difference? In the first case, we base our assumption of objective, without parentheses, reality on something we claim is out there in an independent world. We justify that by saying we all see the same thing. It must be objectively real out there. Maturana is saying the reason we all experience the same thing is because of our common structure and language and history of evolution, and what we agree on, the experience that arises in us because of our common structure, that we call objective. But it's now objective in parentheses because it arises through our engagement with the world. We enact that reality. Epistemologically, we cannot really know what's out there. All we have to go on is our experience. We usually assume that our experience is an accurate reflection of what is quote-unquote out there, but we can never actually know this for sure. So Maturana and Varela ground their theory in actual experience. In these explorations, if you start to get really dizzy and kind of anxious about the world disappearing on you, I invite you to put down the book or whatever you're reading and just breathe some. Notice your actual experience. Don't get so wound out in abstract thinking that you lose track of what your actual experience is. You're still in your body, you're still sitting in your room, you still got a cup of tea in your hand. Keep track of the actual moment-by-moment experience. And remember, these are stories that Maturana and others come up with to try to make sense of our experience. But your experience is not going away or changing in some sense of disappearing, that you're not floating off into the middle of nowhere simply because you're considering that there's no external reality apart from your own cognition. Here's an example. Imagine how a simple object like a table might look to a spider or an infant. It seems evident they would perceive it quite differently than I, an adult human, do. At this point, I might say, yes, but I see it as it really is. Now imagine seeing the table as a physicist might claim it, quote-unquote, really is. Electrons swirling through large empty space around jiggling clusters of protons and neutrons. The physicist's version, they might assure me, is the most accurate. I can also imagine the table as I would see it if I were a carpenter who had built it, shaped and sanded the surface, turned the legs on a lathe, assembled and varnished the pieces. I would be aware of every variation in grain, each small flaw of workmanship, the nearly invisible bloody stains from my sliced finger. Compare these versions to your own. Which is the most accurate representation of how the world really is? Or are they all equally accurate from distinct points of view? As a social example, think of two people reading the book I wrote. One is intrigued and identifies with the inner explorations. The other finds me and my explorations self-indulgent, tedious, and irrelevant to his or her life. I imagine who each of them perceives me to be. I compare those two experiences of who I am to who I experience myself to be. We have three different experiences of who I am, each of theirs and my own. Which of the three is objectively, without parentheses, correct? Who am I actually? Is there an ideal, unbiased, accurate answer? If so, who could know with any certainty that he or she has that complete, unbiased answer? Or is the person in the book actually someone different for each of us? This is the position I find myself in. I cannot coherently claim to experience the world as it quote-unquote really is. First, my perceptions are constrained by my physical structure. My perceptual gear is sensitive to only a narrow band of the stimuli that impinge on it, and then constructs an experience based on the neural response that's triggered by the stimuli. My cognitive filters, unless I consciously examine them, automatically narrow the stream of input, so my finite capacity for attention can deal with those influences most important to my survival. Cultural training, language, strongly affects what I perceive and how I interpret it. Finally, my personal epigenetic history, my own life, affect me so strongly that I can actually project preconceived attributes out onto the world and then accept my perceptions as existing out there. When considering the effects of cultural conditioning, we really must acknowledge the profound influence of language. Leaving aside the question of whether consciousness itself arises only via language, it is clear that language not only describes our experience, but fundamentally structures how we experience the world. Maturana argues that we live in language, and while I tend to think he is overstating the case, I do agree that by sharing common linguistic structures, we perceive common, or at least similar realities. As a second example, imagine a ship threading its way on a pitch-black night through a passage bounded by rock cliffs. The pilot cannot see the shape of the passage, and so doesn't know the optimal route to follow. He or she knows what isn't optimal only when the ship crunches into a rock. Each time this happens, if the ship doesn't sink, the pilot will note the position of the rock. Each time through the passage, the pilot plots more points until he/she can make it through without crunching into the rocks. Remember, it's pitch dark, And at this point, the pilot may believe the illusion that she knows the shape of the passage, but she doesn't. The passage could have an infinite number of different shapes that would not block the route followed by the ship. The same relationship can describe our experience of the world. Our perceptual processes construct a version of the world through which we move, physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually, until we bump into an obstruction of which we were previously unaware. Then, to the extent we are open to change, we alter our notion of the world. Finally, we can't know which version of the world might be closest to how the world, quote-unquote, actually is. We can only know those realities that we experience that allow us to survive and minimize our suffering. We can never know how the world, quote-unquote, really is, but only our own experience of it.